This episode is brought to you by Curiosity Stream, a subscription streaming service that offers thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles. Right now, you guys can get 25% off the cost of a subscription. More on them in just a bit. In the early 1860s, the territory of Colorado would have been the perfect setting for a classic Western movie. Mexican farmers uneasily cohabited with recently arrived American settlers and gold prospectors. The Union cavalry and U.S. Marshals patrolled the canyons, woodlands, and gulches, searching for bandits, skirmishing with the native nations, or recruiting volunteers for the ongoing Civil War in the East. But from spring to autumn 1863, these lawmen would be confronted with a whole new breed of horror, one we would normally associate with another genre altogether. The territory's settlers faced 3 seasons of terror due to the murderous insanity of the Axeman of Colorado, Filipe Espinosa. Described at the time as a Mexican bandit, he achieved infamy as one of the first, if not the first, serial killer of the Wild West. Filipe Nerio Espinosa was born in 1827 in what is today known as the El Rito unincorporated community in Arriba County, New Mexico. He was the older of 5 siblings. One of them, his brother Vivian, was born in 1831, and he had become a trusted partner in crime. There's only sparse information about the early lives of Filipe and Vivian, and what we know is that their parents were subsistence farmers of meager means. Literacy was not a given amongst these rural communities, yet at least Filipe and Vivian could read and write. Filipe was known amongst his neighbors for his impulsive, volatile, and violent temper. This worsened after the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. After the war, the United States acquired large swaths of territory from Mexico, including the lands where the Espinosas had settled. The territory of Guadalupe, Hidalgo allowed Mexican residents to remain in the newly ceded lands, but Washington also encouraged settlers to travel west and start farming the same territories. Inevitably, simmering tension and open conflict manifested between the two communities, known as Hispanos and Anglos. As a proud Hispano, Filipe resented the Anglo newcomers. He saw them as usurpers, oppressors, and enemies of the true Catholic faith. Both Espinosa brothers were indeed devoutly religious and were members of the Holy Brotherhood of the Blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. Members of this fraternity were also known as Penitents and provided philanthropic help to the less fortunate. However, some of their number also indulged in extreme religious practices such as self-flagellation. It's not clear if Filipe inflicted such violence upon himself, but it appears that he did inflict it upon others. In 1854, the 27-year-old Espinosa decided he wanted to marry, but as he had no luck with the local ladies, he traveled south to the village of Tate and abducted 2 sisters, Secundina and Eugenia, aged 17 and 11, respectively. Thankfully, he almost immediately set free Eugenia, but he kept the older sister with him for several days, mentally and physically abusing her. Secundina finally escaped and returned to her family, quickly chased by Filipe. But her father, terrified by Espinosa's violent character, convinced the girl to marry her abductor. We don't know if their relationship developed into less toxic patterns, but we know for sure that they went on to have 3 children. In 1858, the Espinosa extended family moved from El Rito to the San Luis Valley, southern Colorado. The Espinosas settled into a plaza or community of small farmhouses. According to different sources, this plaza was either known as San Rafael or San Judas, and we're gonna go with Judas. By April 1861, the American Civil War had erupted. Colorado was not yet a state, rather a territory, and the ravages of war had not yet reached the San Luis Valley. According to the census of the time, Filipe and little brother Vivian were making a living as a brickmaker and farmer, respectively. Yet around this time, it appears that the 2 brothers took to banditry. It is unclear who was the bad influence or exactly what were their crimes, possibly cattle rustling, but it seems that they earned a reputation in the press as desperate and lawless. For much of 1862, the Espinosas were occasional bandits, amateurs, if you like, but their criminal career was about to take a sharp turn in December. Around that time, a priest from the town of Taos reported a gruesome robbery to the U.S. cavalry stationed in Fort Garland. 2 masked men had held up a wagon carrying some of the priest's properties. The bandits looted the vehicle, then seized the driver, Juan Gonzalez. They tied the poor man underneath the wagon and then whipped the horses, sending them galloping across the rocky soil. The driver's head and face hit every bump and stone on the path, turning it into a bloody pulp. Luckily, he survived and was able to identify the culprits, the Espinosa brothers of San Judas Plaza. Cavalry Lieutenant Hart organized an expedition in mid-January 1863, accompanied by 10 horsemen and U.S. Marshal George Austin. The lawman paid 2 visits to Felipe Espinosa's farmhouse, the first time they pretended to be on a recruitment mission. Most of the cavalrymen were Hispanos after all, so why not enlist them and then join the Union Army in the Civil War? Vivin talked to the lieutenant quite civilly, apparently. It's not clear why Hart did not arrest him and Felipe then and there. Instead, the detachment left and returned 5 days later. This time, Hart and Austin went straight for the arrest, locking Felipe and Vivin into their house. But then chaos broke loose. Apparently, the Espinosas had access to a veritable arsenal, which nobody had cared to confiscate. The 2 brothers started firing from the windows with pistols, rifles, and even bows and arrows. The cavalry shot back with little success until Hart ordered the house to be set on fire. At that point, Felipe and Vivin made a desperate sortie, discharging more and more arrows. The lieutenant drew his pistol and fired all of his rounds, missing every single time. His second pistol didn't seem to work, so he threw it to the ground in frustration. And that's when it decided to work. A bullet went off at that moment, wounding Hart on the forehead. In the meantime, the Espinosas were running away across the frozen river canals. Marshal Austin gave chase, but his horse slipped on the ice. Man and beast crashed to the ground. The whole expedition had been a disaster. The 2 bandit brothers had disappeared into the San Juan Mountains. The marshal had a broken leg, the lieutenant had almost shot himself in the brain, and sadly, a corporal had been killed in the hail of gunfire. The army reacted harshly to the debacle. They completely burned down the Espinosa's farmhouse and confiscated all of their belongings, including their livestock. The entire extended clan was left destitute as a result. The incident may be at the root of the darkness that descended on Colorado, the killing rage of the Espinosa brothers. Alright, we'll get back to today's video in just a moment, but first, here's a word from today's sponsor, CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a subscription streaming service that offers thousands of documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals. Think of it as the Netflix for nerds, the Hulu for history buffs. CuriosityStream is available on many platforms and web apps, including Roku, Android, Xbox One, Smart TVs, iOS, Chromecast, Amazon Fire, Amazon Kindle, and Apple TV. It's also offered worldwide, and with its constantly updated content, you'll always have something to watch. For example, this spring they added an 8-part series called The Bone Detectives. It's great stuff. Now, if you like biographies though, and I've got to think you do because you're maybe subscribed to this channel, you're at least watching it, maybe head over to CuriosityStream and check out bio-documentaries on Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, and so many more famous names. And you could also check out American Icons, a 9-part series that tells the story of Babe Ruth, Eleanor Roosevelt, Mark Twain, and more. Go to curiositystream.com for unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And right now, you guys can use the promo code Biographics to save 25% off the cost of an annual subscription, which comes out to $14.99. Not per month, per year, which is an incredible deal. So again, curiositystream.com/biographics, 25% off, making it just $14.99 for the whole year. And now back to today's video. Felipe and Vivin stole 2 horses during their retreat and made the mountains their new home on the run from the law. According to later lore, it was during one of the freezing nights camping in the woods that Felipe had a vision, a revelation. The Virgin Mary appeared in his dreams. Sent as a messenger from God, the Virgin had ordered Felipe to kill and kill again until the blood of 600 Anglos had been spilled. According to Felipe's own later writings, he had lost 6 relatives during the Mexican-American War, and he would wash that trespass in blood, of course, by killing 100 Anglos for each Espinosa. Whatever the motivation, the Espinosas were hell-bent on going on a killing spree. Their hunting ground initially was an area called Sawmill Gulch, just outside of Canyon City. It later became known as Dead Man's Gulch. Their first victim was sawmill worker Franklin Bruce, shot on March 16, 1863. According to some newspaper reports, a crucifix made of sticks protruded from his bullet wound. 2 days later, it was lumberjack Henry Harkens' turn. His co-workers found him one evening, laying inside his cabin. He had been shot in the forehead with a Colt Navy revolver. He also had 2 stab wounds on his chest. The most gruesome detail is that the murderers had split his head in half with an axe, and they'd inflicted further blows to his skull, scattering fragments of bone and brain matter on the floor. In a matter of days, the third victim was found, James Addleman, killed near Wilkerson Pass, west of Colorado Springs. During April, the bloody Espinosas targeted the town of Fairplay. Jacob Binkley and Abraham Shoup were taken by surprise as they camped outside the city limits. Binkley was shot in the back and died on the spot. Shoup was stabbed 3 times and tried to escape, but collapsed after a short run. 3 more men were slain by the end of the month. 1 had been shot, another one's head was crushed under a rock, a third one had died with a bloody crucifix carved onto his chest. At the time, lawmen had not connected these deaths with the 2 bandits from San Judas. They believed the culprit to be a lone wolf, dubbed by the press the Axeman of Colorado. The dwellers of the territory were gripped by fear and suspicion. Any stranger wandering into town could be the dreaded killer. An unlucky prospector, Mr. Foster, arrived in the town of Alma at the wrong time. He was suspected of being the Axeman and beset by a vigilante mob. The townsfolk dragged him to a tree for hanging. He was saved at the last minute by the oratory prowess of a minister who subdued the crowd. The governor of the territory, John Evans, offered a bounty for the capture of the Axeman. He also appointed Colonel John Chivington to lead an infantry detachment to search the region. One of the officers involved was Lieutenant Shoup, brother of one of the Fairplay victims. He offered to double the bounty out of his own pocket, but the Axeman, or we should say Axemen, remained elusive. It was later rumored that they were helped by other brothers of the Penitente fraternity, but it is more realistic that they simply moved very quickly along mountain paths, preying on lone travelers. As they added more victims to their tally, the spree killers refined their modus operandi. In the second phase of their descent into madness, they ditched the Colt for long-range rifles. After stalking their prey, they cut them down from afar. Then they descended upon the corpses like vultures and set to work. Bodies were found disemboweled, decapitated, and with their hearts brutally removed or impaled by wooden stakes. However ghoulish, the 2 murderers were all too human, and sooner or later, they would commit a mistake. A lumberjack called Matthew Metcalfe was driving a wagon down California Gulch when the Espinosas suddenly appeared in front of him. Without saying a word, one of them fired a shot, hitting Metcalfe on the left breast. The lumberman fell backwards into the wagon as the panicked horses dashed wildly away. Felipe Espinosa later wrote in his diary, "Killed a man in a wagon." But he hadn't. Matthew had been saved by a booklet of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation stuffed into his breast pocket. The pages had slowed down the flight of the bullet, saving Metcalfe's life. Finally, there was a survivor, someone who could help describe and locate the scourges of Colorado. Metcalfe reported the botched shooting, and a posse of 8 men was quickly formed in Fairplay, led by John McCannon. The posse found a promising trail of hoofprints close to California Gulch. Following the path, the horsemen found a gruesome clue, a corpse butchered beyond recognition. Well, almost. One member of the posse recognized the body because it belonged to his brother. McCannon and his men continued riding for 1 day and 1 night. After daybreak, they saw 2 horses calmly grazing behind a screen of campfire smoke. The posse split into 2 groups and approached the campsite. They crept through the grass, fingers nervously twitching by the trigger of their guns. When a human figure emerged from a bush, the men of Fairplay reacted quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. Without any warning, a shot rang out. A red stain bloomed on the man's side as he slumped to the ground. It could have been any innocent traveler, but in this case it wasn't. Vivin Espinosa cried out in fury and returned fire with his Colt. More rounds came flying in his direction until one tore through his brain. A second figure came running from behind the trees. McCannon shouted to hold fire, believing him to be a member of his posse. This was Filipe, of course. Taking advantage of the moment of confusion, he sprinted away before the Fairplay gunman could take aim. Espinosa disappeared into the woods, pursued by those who had killed his brother. He managed to evade capture until sundown, when the posse returned to the encampment. The now lone axeman followed them stealthily and shot one last time before disappearing for good. The bullet missed the man who had killed Vivin by a mere 3 inches. McCannon and his men returned to Fairplay with a valuable load, all the loot that the Espinosas had stolen from their victims, and Felipe's own diary. Based on the property seized, Fairplay authorities concluded that the outlaws had killed at least 12 men. But in Felipe's diary, they found an unsent letter to the Colorado governor in which he confessed to 32 victims. With Viven dead and Filipe once more on the run, Colorado breathed a sigh of relief. The summer was relatively calm. No more Anglos were felled by the axe. The army and posses of settlers still roamed the woods and mountains, but Filipe managed to elude them, even returned several times to his family's dwelling, San Judas Plaza. When visiting, he dropped further letters and portions of his diaries, confessing to the string of murders and threatening further violence. He also took notice of his family's condition. Following the cavalry raid in January, the Espinosas had fallen into abject poverty. It was during one of these visits that Filipe recruited a new accomplice, a nephew of which little is known. He may have been 14, and his name may have been Julio. It's not even clear why he recruited the boy. Was he looking to initiate a new generation of Espinosas to anti-Anglo violence, or maybe he just needed somebody to look after the horses and the campfire? Whatever Julio's age or function, Filipe returned to his murderous ways. In autumn 1863, as the leaves started to fall, so too did the bodies. In a matter of a few weeks, at least 11 killings were recorded in southern and central Colorado attributed to Espinosa. On the 11th of October 1863, Filipe and Julio had set up an ambush at Veta Pass. As the wagon approached, Filipe attacked, guns in hand. The wagon occupants, a man and a woman, fled on foot in opposite directions. The Espinosas ran after the man, called Philbrook, but soon lost track of him on the mountainside. They returned to Veta, looking for the woman, Dolores Sanchez. Meanwhile, she had hidden aboard another wagon driven by two Hispanos. Filipe and Julio held up that wagon as well, and upon finding that the drivers were Mexican, they seemed eager to let them go unharmed. Dolores could have made it unscathed too, had she not emerged from her hiding place, pleading for the drivers' lives. Her generosity of spirit would not be rewarded, alas. Filipe allowed the two drivers to trot away, but would not reserve the same favor for the lady. With Julio's help, Filipe bound her tightly and then proceeded to rape her. The Espinosas abandoned her on the mountainside as they galloped towards more mayhem. But help was on its way. Philbrook had reached Fort Garland and alerted its commander, Colonel Tappan, to the situation. Tappan dispatched a patrol who found Dolores in bad shape, but still alive. Back at the fort, Dolores and Philbrook were able to give a detailed description of Filipe. Tappan was ready to strike back, but he would not lead the expedition. He knew just the right man who could locate the Espinosas and deal the final blow. That man was named Thomas Tate Tobin, a well-known tracker, trapper, and U.S. Army scout who had fought alongside Wild Bill Hickok and Kit Carson in the wars against the Native Americans. Tappan summoned Tobin to the fort, where he had the opportunity to further question Philbrook and Dolores. With all the info he needed, the scout reared to start the hunt immediately, alone. Only upon Tappan's insistence did he accept an escort of 15 cavalrymen. With his uncanny tracking skills, Tobin followed the trail of the Espinosas for 3 days and 3 nights. Every broken stick, every bent blade of grass on the ground spoke to Tobin, telling him where the bandits were headed. On the morning of the 4th day, the scout saw magpies flying in circles in the distance, an indication of human presence. This was confirmed by a thin column of smoke lazily rising above the treetops. Tobin ordered the soldiers to stay put, loaded his rifle, dropped to his stomach, and crawled toward the campsite. 2 men sat by the fire with a dead ox beside them. The tracker recognized them from the description he had heard at the fort. It was the Espinosas. A snapping sound reverberated through the forest, maybe a breaking branch. It was enough to startle Filipe, who reached for his rifle. Tobin reacted on instinct, barely taking aim. He released a slug, hitting Filipe on the chest. The killer fell backward onto the campfire, calling for Julio to run away. The young nephew sped through the woods, a swift shadow appearing and disappearing amongst the trees. Now Tobin took time to perfectly adjust his aim. He squeezed the trigger a second time, and Julio's spine was shattered by hot lead. But Filipe was still alive. He crawled across the forest floor and braced himself against a tree. He lifted his rifle and shot against Tobin, but missed. The Union cavalrymen now intervened, releasing a devastating volley. Filipe Espinosa, the axeman sent by the Virgin to slay the Anglos, withered and jerked against the tree bark as bullet after bullet drained every drop of life from his body. But when he fell to the ground, apparently he still had 1 ounce of life left inside him. Tobin walked slowly to him and lifted him by the hair. As he pulled out his bowie knife, Tobin asked him, "Do you know who I am?" With his last breath, Filipe muttered, "Bruto." A brute. Then the brute's blade fell twice upon the neck of Espinosa. Days later, Tobin returned to Fort Garland. As he strode into the office of Colonel Tappan, he announced, "Got them." Tappan asked, "Got what?" Tobin opened the flour sack he had been carrying and pulled out the heads of Filipe and Julio. And thus ends the narrative of Filipe, Vivin, and Julio, the bloody Espinosas, who may have been the first documented serial killers in the history of the Wild West. Events grew to acquire legendary status, perpetuated by one macabre relic. Felipe's head, preserved in a jar of alcohol, was exhibited as a travelling act before ending up on the desk of a newspaper editor. Then the head disappeared as the memory of the Espinosas faded from history. According to author Adam Jones, a preserved head, which may have been his, was found in the early 2010s in the basement of Colorado's Capitol building. It was incinerated before it could be analyzed. To this day, many details concerning the Espinosas' killings and their eventual demise are still disputed. Even the motivations behind their spree are not entirely clear. Was Filipe driven to kill by delirious dreams and visions of the Virgin Mary? Or was the violence political in nature, a revengeful rampage against the Anglo oppressor? Maybe he was just a vile psychopath who had strung along his younger brother and teenage nephew. Or was he an insurgent fighting with the wrong methods against oppression? Perhaps Felipe's rage was fueled by all of these elements, and the raid on his plaza was just the last straw that had tipped him over the edge into darkness. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Just before you leave today, a quick plug for one of my other shows, The Casual Criminalist. It's a true crime show where we dive into the stories of some of the worst murderers, serial killers, cult leaders. We cover it all, but it's also pretty laid back, doesn't take itself too seriously, and it could even be called a bit fun. It's The Casual Criminalist. There's a link below. Also available as a podcast, by the way. And thank you for watching.